I would like to welcome to the stage the President of the Division of Paediatrics and Child Health, Dr. Sarah Dalton.
Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Professor David Forbes as the 2018 recipient of the Howard Williams Medal. Professor Forbes graduated from the University of Western Australia in 1973 and trained in paediatrics, gastroenterology and nutrition in Perth and Calgary. He's worked in paediatric emergency medicine, general and rural paediatrics, in paediatric gastroenterology and child mental health. From 1991, he held an academic appointment at the University of Western Australia. This provided the opportunity to pursue broad child health interests that focus upon the interface between physical health and psychological medicine, with special interests in social disadvantage, mental health and nutrition, and functional gastroenterological disorders. Professor Forbes has provided broad paediatric educational leadership, leading undergraduate teaching in paediatrics for the University of Western Australia, management of paediatric vocational training at the Princess Margaret Hospital, and as a member of the chair of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians Paediatric Physician Training Committee. He's worked in child health policy as chair of the Paediatrics and Child Health Policy Committee and a member of the RACP Policy Advisory Committee. Professor Forbes was also the inaugural co-lead of the Western Australian Child and Youth Health Network, developing the state's first framework in the delivery of child policy. He currently works as a clinical advisor in the Department of Health in Western Australia. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Forbes.
Good morning. Dr. Dalton, President of the Paediatric and Child Health Division, fellows and trainees, thank you for the opportunity of being here this morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm humbled today to be in the company of some of the giants of Australian paediatrics, and I thank the Division for the honour they have bestowed upon me with this award. And I would like to acknowledge the many colleagues who have worked with me across my career. In the title of this presentation, I've emphasised interfaces. This is a high-resolution thermal image of a physical interface. These are interesting places because of the distortions that occur there. And I think the physical distortions have parallels in paediatric medicine, the environment of physical health and mental health, social and economic issues. This is the zone where children's lives are most distorted and where advocacy is most needed, and typically where there are the greatest opportunities to advocate for children. I would also like to emphasise the sub-theme of the meeting, disruption for healthy futures, because advocacy is a powerful form of disruption. Unfortunately, I never knew Howard Williams, but it's impossible to be part of Australian paediatrics and not be aware of him. He was described as a paediatrician inspired by the vision that the health of children was the basis of the health of the nation, and indeed for its whole social well-being. This vision was prescient, even though out of step with his time. If ever there was an advocate for children, it was Howard. Today I want to emphasise the opportunities for advocacy that come our way every day. I always begin my lectures to students on nutrition and growth by reminding them that there are three elements of paediatric medicine that are relatively unique, and I emphasise the relative: growth, development, and advocacy. I see advocacy as a core part of the discipline and practice of paediatric medicine, an essential component that extends well beyond child protection and lies at the heart of all paediatric subspecialties. As I explore this, I would like to pay tribute to a few of the many mentors and colleagues who had important influences on my career, and also to celebrate some of my paediatric heroes who have advocated strongly for child health. The first is William Bowie MacDonald, commonly referred to as Bill, or irreverently by senior students as shifting dullness. Bill was a contemporary of Howard Williams and shared with him a history of Air Force War service before becoming the Foundation Professor of Paediatrics and Child Health in Perth. Bill espoused the WA concept of health, outlined here, as being more than the absence of disease, but a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. He, like Howard, recognised the social determinants of health and ill health and promoted a holistic view of paediatrics. Bill co-authored with the late Jane Williams and I, while we were still students, my first publication. This was a student project focused on the experience of the only paediatric hospital in Western Australia on the burden of health in Aboriginal young people. This was in fact the first detailed analysis of the burden of ill health on Aboriginal children in Australia. While Aboriginal children made up approximately 4% of the WA child population, for disorders of nutrition and infection, they accounted for up to 50% of the bed occupancy. Bill was enthusiastic, encouraging and facilitating. He arranged for Jane Williams and I to meet with the then editor of the Australian Paediatric Journal. He fired my enthusiasm for advocacy by facilitating an approach to paediatrics and child health beyond that which I had envisaged. This experience fueled a passion for advocacy that has persisted throughout my career. I'd just like to acknowledge several other people. The first of these is Lou Landau, a previous recipient of the Howard Williams Medal and a trainee of Howard Williams, who worked on the longitudinal study of paediatric lung function in Melbourne. Lou succeeded Bill McDonald as Professor of Paediatrics and became my boss for about 20 years. From him, I learned about quiet advocacy, which stemmed from high-level, holistic views of child well-being and constantly working for the discipline of paediatrics, promoting high clinical standards and research that informed clinical practice. He taught me about advocating in all that we do. I trained in gastroenterology with Grant Gall in Calgary. Grant taught me about the importance of science to clinical medicine and the importance of mountains to the soul. I also like to acknowledge the influence of these two people, Michael Gracie and Fiona Stanley, both tireless advocates for underprivileged populations in our community. What do we mean by advocacy? In its simplest form, it means speaking out in support of an individual or group. The term advocate is derived from the Latin advoco and involves the concept of calling upon someone to represent us or to call upon the gods to intervene on our behalf. What I'm going to do now is consider the ways in which we advocate from day to day. The concept of advocacy has different meanings in different settings in our society. I quite like this description from Wolfensberger. He was a disability specialist and a tireless advocate for those most disadvantaged in our society, whom he regarded as needing a parent for life. Interestingly, he was not embarrassed by his paternalism. Advocacy is speaking, acting, writing with minimal conflict of interest on the behalf of the perceived interests of another group. To promote, protect, defend their welfare and justice by being primarily concerned with their fundamental needs, by remaining loyal and accountable to them in a way which is emphatic and vigorous, and which may well be costly to the advocate. It's important to note the importance and contribution of laws and rights to advocacy for children. Medical laws regulate professional conduct and define much of our conduct as health professionals. By doing so, they give rise to concepts of patient rights, which act as a type of consumer law. Public health law, by contrast, regulates the state's authority and its duty to define and lessen community health risks, as well as to promote the health of the community. Public health laws are limited by what they don't regulate, and so what they don't define. So medical and public health law has been somewhat limited in its ability to promote the interests of children, so there's been increasing reliance over the last 2 decades upon human rights. Human rights are regarded by ethicists as unchallengeable, fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled simply because they are a human being. They are commonly seen as being based upon natural laws which exist independently of any culture, regime, or country. They derive from philosophical reasoning and are believed to apply to everybody. Although aspirational, the human rights have been codified in the Universal Declaration, which was accepted by the United Nations in 1948, and they represent a common standard of achievement for all people of all nations and sets out for the first time fundamental rights to be universally protected. The General Assembly of the UN adopted the Convention of the Rights of the Child in 1989 and in the process defined a child as being under 18 years of age. The importance of the UNCRC is that in considering the needs of children, we have a reference point in international law that relates to civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights independent of parents. It means that in acting for children, we're not doing so out of the goodness of our hearts, but because we recognise that in a just society, vulnerable individuals should not be denied their defined rights. We can identify the denial of rights in individual cases and as it relates to groups of children. A rights-based approach may also go some way to protecting our patients from our own paternalism and assumptions that by virtue of our professional training, we automatically know what represents the best interests of children. The major philosophical underpinnings of the UNCRC are firstly, non-discrimination. The rights apply to all children. Secondly, the best interest of the child. This remains difficult to define and may involve a balance between autonomy and beneficence and non-malfeasance. Thirdly, each child has a right to live, to survive and to develop. This involves acknowledging and respecting the dignity of the child and the various elements of their life. And finally, respect for the views of the child. This follows from Article 12, which grants to each child capable of forming their own views the right to freely express them and should ensure participation of the child in decisions taken about them. The Australian government ratified the Convention in December 1990 and also ratified 2 of the optional protocols, that on children in the armed forces and children in traffic and prostitution, but continues to express formal reservation about Article 37C, which refers to children in detention and calls for respect for children deprived of their liberty and acknowledgement of their needs. This is clearly still relevant to the Australian government and to a number of state governments which recognise childhood as beginning at a lower age and thus treat children in corrective services as if they were adults. I'd like now to turn attention to the opportunities we have for advocacy in our day-to-day life, and I think the obligation I believe we have to pursue these. One of the key agencies for advocacy is via our professional organisations, which I see as the raison d'etre for these organisations. As Sarah mentioned, I've been fortunate to have long periods of involvement with the college and have been entrusted with the chairmanship of both the Educational Committee and the Policy Committee for Paediatrics. I regard these experiences as important opportunities for advocacy, and this was my motivation for participating. My first experience was in education and training. I joined and then took over the chairmanship of the Committee for Paediatric Physician Training from Dr. Jill Sewell. Jill had initiated something very important, which was not so always welcomed by trainees, called mandatory training. This was the concept that all paediatric trainees should have experience in or exposure to developmental or community paediatrics or mental health, and thus have a broad view of child health and be able to work with all the various factors causing disease. These elements have now been distilled into a set of knowledge, skills and attitudes, but back when they were introduced, they were much more contentious. At the time paediatric specialties were growing, they were supervised by adult subspecialties, and as an advocacy exercise, we took the requirement for mandatory training to the Committee for Physician Training. I still smile inwardly when I recall presenting to a full meeting of the Physician Training Council, and I was challenged by the chair about the importance of this experience for anyone working with paediatric patients in subspecialties, and chose the example with children with HIV. I thought at the time, this is exactly the reason why paediatricians need these skills, and this was a really important act of advocacy through education by the college. The Paediatric and Child Health Policy and Advocacy is a more obvious vehicle for advocacy. Paediatrics has a long history in this field, which was not always been so welcomed by other members of the college, but I'm pleased to say over the last 10 years this has changed, and the college as a whole has become much more involved in advocacy. This is a list of the policies promoted during the time I was involved with the Advocacy Committee, and clearly emphasises the point that we can, by our professional actions, speak up and improve the circumstances for children in our community, both by defining standards of care and by promoting the best interests and rights of children. These are essentially clinical practice guidelines, and these are policy actions aimed at specifically disadvantaged groups. Some can clearly fit in either group. This has been really important in shaping the landscape of paediatrics in Australia, and I would like to pay tribute to the paediatricians who preceded and succeeded me in this role, Neil Wigg and Jackie Small, both tireless advocates. I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple of specific advocacy actions. This was an action led by Dr. Sharon Goldfeld in conjunction with the Australian Council on Healthcare Standards. This was important because it defined the standards of care for children admitted to hospitals anywhere in Australia when they didn't have the luxury of being admitted to a specialist childcare facility. It determined where they should be admitted, how they should be treated, and was a really important landmark. The other one I'd just like to draw your attention to is the issue of refugees in general and children in particular. This is an area in which we still need to keep a close watch. I noted earlier that the Australian government has not endorsed Article 37C, although official data says that there are no children in detention centres anymore. There are still a large number of children in community detention. These children may fall through the cracks and don't automatically have access to healthcare, education, social services as other children do. As recently as last week in my current role, we've been trying to advocate for the Minister to ensure that these children are protected in Western Australia. The college has had a number of important activities in this arena. I'm pleased to say the Paediatrics and Child Health Division led this initially with this policy, and then more recently the college has extended that. And paediatricians across the country have advocated for the rights of children in detention and raised attention of the community at large. Most of us belong to other professional organisations as well. These can be subverted, often willingly, to advocacy organisations. CAPGAN, or the Commonwealth Association of Paediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition, grew out of an old-style paediatric gastroenterology focused on diarrhoea and malnutrition, no endoscopies in that period and no PPIs. In some ways, it was an old boys network. Its small scientific meetings grew, and now it has membership in all those parts of the world with colonial links to Britain, including the US. It promotes the science related to diarrhoea and malnutrition, both underlying physiology but also treatment in third world countries. More importantly, it has developed into an advocacy organisation. It's promoted child health research and science in Commonwealth countries. It's had observer status at CHOGM meetings, and on some occasions has been the only spokes group for 2 billion people related to child health. The interface that I've spent most time working in over the last 2 decades is between malnutrition and mental health. This is a zone that needs strong, ongoing advocacy. I've adopted the broad WHO definition of mental health. That is, mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realises his or her own potential. They can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. By extrapolation, mental ill health is defined as the reverse of these. Too often I find that our systems focus upon ICD classifications and they actually neglect children in need. The WHO has gone on to emphasise that poor mental health and mental illness is associated with rapid social change, stressful work conditions, gender discrimination, social exclusion, unhealthy lifestyle, risks of violence, physical health, and human rights violation. This is a complex interface where nutrition is compromised and children are damaged. We all know that social environment is a very important role for mental health, and I'd just like to remind you of how it can interact with nutritional state. This slide depicts median height of children in Norway, reported across the 20th century by age group for boys and girls. You can see in the early part of the 20th century associated with clear improvements in social status, improvements in median height. Then there's this dip here at the Second World War. Norway was an invaded country and children were clearly compromised. Social adversity influences growth and can have other long-term outcomes. Just in case you'd forgotten that history is usually written by the victors in any conflict, these are the records of German children across the 20th century and 2 world wars. Children suffer wherever there is hardship and conflict. Leonardo Marta was a virologist and a public health physician, but he was also a hero of paediatrics. He documented the relationship between nutrition and adverse social circumstances in a 9-year study in the village of Santa Maria Cauquenes in Guatemala, and demonstrated the serious consequences of these interactions of adverse social circumstances on growth and health of children. This is the growth record of 1 child, compared with the 50th centile for North American children. And what Marta has done is document the recurrent infections across this child's life and the severe impairment to growth. He related this to breastfeeding, which probably ceased around here at 6 months, illness, growth and development. While these relationships are now taken for granted, in 1974 the publication, The Children of Santa Maria Cauquenes, was a landmark in paediatric and public health literature. Leonardo Marta's work highlights the influence of the social determinants of health in disadvantaged society, and his advocacy provided direction for several generations of paediatricians, public health physicians and legislators. This is a more recent example of the relationship between environmental disadvantage and risk factors for mental health and the adverse nutritional consequences, and is a reminder to me at least that the advocacy we need to take will frequently be focused upon things other than the index disease. The data here comes from a study from Princeton which looked at social risk factors, shown here: intrapartner violence, food insecurity, father's incarceration, maternal depression, maternal alcohol and drug use, and housing insecurity. Girls who are exposed at these ages 1 and 3, and they had 2 to 3 or more than 4 of these factors, had an almost twofold risk of obesity at age 5. A very direct influence. Interestingly, boys, it was not the same. I suspect they'd gone down the conduct disorder path. So social adversity has severe consequences for growth and development. In 1996, I accidentally fell into a clinical and research opportunity that combined the interests of nutrition and mental health, and with Brett McDermott and Karen Gulick began the multidisciplinary eating disorders program at Princess Margaret Hospital for Children in Perth. Eating disorders are a serious and nasty collection of illnesses which rob young people of their health, their futures, and sometimes their lives. This program has provided a comprehensive service across the community, but more than that, it's been a long-term exercise in advocacy. This graph, which is a result of one of the advocacy exercises, highlights the prevalence of eating disorders in Australia. And it's interesting, anorexia nervosa, which often gets the most press, is not the most important, but nearly 14% of young people have binge eating disorders, and that there are a range of other eating disorders. Probably more worrying is the assessed deaths that are believed to occur in Australia each year, and I'll come back to the reasons why later. But this group of economists estimated that there are about 1,800 deaths a year attributable to eating disorders, 1,300 in females and 500 in males. Our advocacy experience with this disease group began with our peers and with our health services and administrators, who tended to see high-maintenance young people who do little to help themselves and generate excessive expenditure. Many people have difficulty in perceiving the intensely troubled children and youth who struggle to express their distress in ways which are understood. Much of what we did in developing a clinical service was straightforward advocacy, advocating for spaces in hospital, for people to provide services that are comprehensive and which goes some way to matching the trajectory of what's a chronic disease, where we can expect high rates of recovery from adolescents, although the time to recovery is measured in years. This experience in delivering a service aligned itself with others around Australia: psychiatrists, psychologists, paediatricians, physicians, dietitians, but most importantly, parents, patients, and the support group. The National Eating Disorders Collaboration began out of this, which generated government support, development of resources, and most importantly, a voice in Canberra. It's a very important example of ongoing patient-focused advocacy arising out of clinical practice, driven by research, but engaging with consumers. A little while ago, I suggested that just as poor mental health is associated with poor nutrition in early life may lead to long-term mental health and should be an important focus of paediatric long-term mental health issues, and should be an important focus of paediatric advocacy. I'd just like to show you two historical examples. The bitterly cold Hunger winter at the end of the Second World War saw extremely adverse environmental conditions combined with widespread starvation in Western Holland, the area shown here outside the dotted line, deliberately used as a weapon of war. Food intake decreased, and at its worst, in the midwinter 1944-45, adults were consuming less than 600 kilocalories a day. This exposure resulted in a range of long-term adverse effects, including mental illness, which is thought to be epigenetic, and there's some evidence that this is transmissible. The dose of malnutrition appears to be important in timing and extent, with addiction being a consequence of early malnutrition, unipolar affective disorder in mid, and schizophrenia across the duration of pregnancy. This experiment was created again in China at the Great Leap Forward, where the destruction of agriculture is associated with famine, and intake in a wide area of China was decreased to about 1,500 kilocalories per day. It's estimated that 30 million people died and 30 million lost births during this period. This is really interesting work which has looked at the decrease in the number of births and the adjusted risk for schizophrenia in two different regions of China. It's clear that the first 1,000 days of life are really critical for the whole of our lives. I talked about why anorexia nervosa is important and people die. Standardized mortality rate of almost 6. This wreaks havoc across the entire life from a whole range of issues related to mental health and the consequences of severe malnutrition early in life. In the 21st century, do we still need to maintain as vigorous child health advocacy as we have in the past? I'd like to suggest that we do, because the UNICEF says that unless we make significant changes, by 2030, 167 million children will live in poverty, 69 million children under 5s will have died, and 60 children will be out of school. If we just look at nutritional issues, we might think we're doing it all right because the prevalence of stunting is coming down, but it's still high. It's being caught up by obesity, and we still have a significant number of children with wasting. I just put this in to remind you of what can happen if children are all exposed to good conditions. This was the WHO growth study in 6 continents, measuring growth of infants in optimal conditions. Their growth is the same throughout the world. We have more in common with our socioeconomic peers than we do with our cultural and genetic peers. Even in Australia, we face significant challenges. This is a cartoon, comes from the Human Rights Commission, and emphasises the high rates of childhood homelessness, disability, physical and sexual abuse, mental health problems, and bullying. Aboriginal children are more than twice as likely to experience most of these things than other children. To that, we can add issues like increasing rates of obesity, shown here from this work from Jenny O'Day in Sydney. You can see that with increasing affluence, the rate of obesity is coming down, and the opposite occurs. Children in the bottom quintile of disadvantage have a 47% higher odds of being in a heavier weight category than those in the top quintile, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have a 56% greater risk of being obese. If we look broadly, this is recent data from one Australian state which correlates death in all age groups with socioeconomic advantage, with the most disadvantaged having the greatest rates in 2018 of any group. So how do we tackle problems like that? I always am bemused by this output from a UK think tank of pathways to obesity. This is how to tackle the problem. This is like a bowl of spaghetti with no end. It's impossible to adopt this task, to tackle this task from here. And this is an environment of increasing health expenditure and efforts by our politicians to decrease expenditure. Australia's health expenditure is shown here. It's getting up to about 70,000 per person, and 10% of that goes on health. We're doing reasonably well compared with lots of other countries. We're in the blue, our cousins across the Tasman are in the red, but it's still becoming difficult, and advocacy is going to have to be smarter and going to have to be driven by different factors. So it's no surprise that the next generation of advocates are not paediatricians. People like James Heckman, who won a Nobel Prize for Economics. In 2014, he established the Centre for the Economics of Human Development to study questions about the factors that contribute to inequality, disparate life outcomes, and interventions. And he is one of my 21st century paediatric heroes. He's conducted a number of studies, randomised community-based trials, and this is data from one. This is the program costs and the estimated net benefits, and his paper is full of economic jargon and formulae. But he's broken down the costs of productivity, parents' income, decreased crime, and decreased health benefits over an extended period. He calculated a rate of 13% return on investment. He's also calculated that investing before the second birthday can return up to an 8-fold return on the dollar. Invest after that, you probably never get your money back. So child health is the way to go. But there's more. And from our part of the world, well, almost. This is from Caspi's group in New Zealand, the Dunedin cohort, and they looked at a group of children recruited in 1972 and followed up to the age of 38, and they calculated that the excess kilograms of this cohort was carried by 20% of the community. And they found the same thing for all these different factors: crime, injury claims, prescription fills, hospital days, obesity, fatherless children, social welfare. And they could predict these children in the first decade of life. So now we know who to target, we actually know what to do. Heckman and David Olds have applied community-based randomised trials of home visitation, typically nurses, but not always, to women during their pregnancy in the first couple of years of life, and they've demonstrated these benefits. So we know who to target, we know how to target, we just have to advocate for them. So we've come a long way from this child who I experienced early in my career, and I did get his parents' permission to use this, and he is alive. The infant mortality rate is narrowing the gap. We made a lot of progress, but if we look around at what we've been seeing in the last year or so, we still have a lot to do in our society. We need to bring rigour to our advocacy, we need to bring science, we need to be persistent. I would like to leave you with the words of Loic, I don't know you, who, in summing up a presentation to the Commonwealth Association of Paediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition in Darwin in 2001 said, "Child health work is political work. Our work goes on, we just have to be smarter." Thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank David for his extraordinary presentation and for being such an unwavering advocate for the well-being of children and young people. I feel that I can summarise in no better way than the words of Wolfensberger, which I've just learned. Thank you for being on their side and for being loyal and accountable in a way that is nothing short of emphatic and vigorous. Thank you for being one of our paediatric heroes. We need to have a photo over here. Thank you. you.